The 1920s was a time of great contradiction in American society. American success in business and economic affairs in the early 20th century led to a period of increased economic freedom, which would eventually lead to the biggest economic crash in history. In this video, we'll break down the political and economic concepts that led to this boom and then the bust. Throughout the 1920s, Republicans held control over both the White House and Congress. As a result, businesses continued to boom and farmers and laborers continued to struggle against corporate power. On the surface, this seems almost no different than what we saw politically in the Gilded Age. However, reform during the Progressive Era meant that by the 1920s, Republicans had backed off their undying support of laissez-faire policies and accepted the idea that the government should take at least a limited role in governing the economy. Let's take a moment to talk about these influential Republican presidents. Warren G. Harding was the choice of the Republican Party in the election of 1920 due to a backroom deal. When he won the presidency, he knew that he needed a strong cabinet to help him govern. He appointed former Supreme Court Justice Charles Hughes as Secretary of State and filled his vacant seat with former President Taft, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, which will be important later, and Andrew Mellon, who now has a university named after him, as Secretary of Treasury. Harding's election slogan, which was extremely popular with the public, was a return to normalcy after World War I. By this, he meant that he wanted to return to emphasis on peacetime production and building up of the American business, rather than on international affairs. However, he let Congress come up with most of the legislation on their own and simply approved what they put before him. Of the laws that he approved, 3 are important. First, he reduced the income tax, which was instituted during World War I to help cover the cost of the war. Second, he increased tariffs under the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act of 1922 to make up for the loss in income tax money. And third, he established the Bureau of the Budget, whose job it was to compile all of the financial data for the government and compile it into one giant budget for Congress to sign off on. As presidents go, Harding would probably have passed as a forgotten minor historical character if it weren't for the Teapot Dome scandal. The president had appointed several dishonest men to important government positions, including Albert Fall as Secretary of the Interior. In 1924, Congress discovered that Fall had accepted bribes from some business friends in exchange for oil leases near Teapot Dome, Wyoming. The Teapot Dome scandal forever tarnished the otherwise commendable record of Harding, who was unable to defend himself because he died mysteriously shortly before that became public. Calvin Coolidge, Harding's vice president, was already a popular figure in America for his actions as governor of Massachusetts in breaking up the Boston police strike of 1919. Despite this popular image as a strikebuster, he was actually a man of very few words, which got him the nickname Silent Cal. When he took over the presidency, he had a simple motto: the business of America is business. When the election of 1920 came around, Coolidge was the Republican nominee. His main competition from the Democratic Party tried to take votes from Coolidge by making an issue of the Teapot Dome scandal as a problem caused by not just Harding, but by the Republican Party as a whole. However, liberal Americans were unhappy with the conservative aspects of both of the major parties, so they split off on their own Progressive Party. Despite the fact that the Progressive Party did well for a third party, Coolidge easily won the election. He then continued to follow the path of his predecessor by keeping a limited government that kept out of the way of growing businesses. He also focused heavily on cutting federal spending to lower the national budget, including a rather unpopular move of rejecting bonuses for World War I veterans. Coolidge chose not to run for a second term in office, so the Republicans turned to Herbert Hoover, who had overseen U.S. food production during World War I and served administratively under 3 presidents, including his time as Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge. During his campaign in 1928, Hoover promised that he could continue to work towards the prosperity that had come under Coolidge's term in office, and suggested that he could end poverty in America altogether during his presidency, which is rather ironic since he led us into the Great Depression. He believed that Americans could come out of poverty by practicing what he called rugged individualism, which was the idea that individuals could succeed if given equal opportunities and free education. This principle would be wildly unpopular during the Great Depression, when Hoover continued to insist that individuals needed to be responsible for their own success, and that government assistance to those struggling would only make them lazy. Obviously, these men were of the opinion that their job was to stay out of the way of growing business. Let's take a moment to discuss exactly what that looked like. Economically, the 1920s saw one of the largest business booms in American history for several reasons. First, companies made greater use of the idea of scientific management and mass production. One of the best examples of this is Henry Ford's assembly line for manufacturing cars. Rather than having several men running back and forth to get things made one car at a time, he set up an assembly line where each man stood in the same place all day and added one component to the car as it passed by. Second, oil and electricity were used increasingly in factories and homes. Electricity in particular made it possible for workers to continue producing things long after the sun went down. And third, government policies favoring businesses, like tax cuts and laying off of antitrust laws, caused businesses to grow substantially. The Federal Reserve also contributed by offering low interest rates on loans and being super loose with bank regulations. However, these government policies also led to increased gaps between the rich and the poor and speculation in markets. Electricity in their homes enabled millions of Americans to purchase new appliances like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines. As a result of these many options available to Americans, the U.S. experienced a major push in colorful, attention-grabbing advertisements. Advertisers often used imagery of happy families or fame and fortune to sell their products to people who could not necessarily afford them. Knowing this, stores began offering the option of buying on credit, which meant that people could purchase a product and pay it off in small monthly payments, much like how a credit card works today. Quickly, though, Americans began buying so much on credit that if anything happened to their steady income, they would be completely unable to pay off their creditors, a process which was one of the many factors that led to economic collapse. One of the many products that Americans rushed to buy was a car. While Henry Ford didn't invent the car, his assembly line made them faster to make and therefore cheaper to buy. Within 15 years, the number of registered cars in the U.S. jumped from 1.2 million to 26.5 million, which averaged to nearly one car per family in the United States. The effect of this was that the car quickly replaced the railroad as the primary means of transportation. It also meant that those industries like steel, glass, rubber, and gasoline now depended on car sales rather than the stability of railroad shipping. One other significant effect, which will become more apparent after the Second World War, was that Americans with cars were not necessarily confined to living in the city anymore. If you didn't have to walk to work each day, you could live anywhere you wanted that was within a reasonable driving distance. So while industrial businesses grew at a quick pace during the 20s, farmers faced significant struggles. During the war, farmers saw a lot of prosperity because the demand for their goods in Europe was high and because the federal government guaranteed a minimum price for wheat and corn, meaning that farmers would always be ensured of some kind of profit, even if they had a bad season. When the war ended, so did prosperity for farmers. Those who borrowed lots of money during the war to expand their farms to meet production now had a hard time paying on those loans. New technologies like chemical fertilizers and tractors only added to this issue as they caused overproduction of the land that drove down prices and would eventually lead to the Dust Bowl. While businessmen were prosperous and farmers were failing, laborers found themselves somewhere in the middle. Wages for laborers went up during the 1920s, but organized unions were on the decline. Part of the reason for this was that many companies insisted on keeping an open shop or keeping their jobs open to only non-union workers. Companies also began practicing what's now called welfare capitalism, where they offered their employees improved benefits and higher pay in order to reduce the negative attitudes and conditions that led to unions in the first place. Henry Ford is an extremely popular example for this use of welfare capitalism. He paid his workers significantly more than other manufacturers, but with a few conditions. Workers were expected to be sober and cleaned up when they came into work in the morning so that they wouldn't pose a safety threat to others. They were also required to allow Ford home visits, where he made sure that the money he paid them was actually going to provide for their families and not used for alcohol or other frivolous purchases. However, this kind of treatment was by no means universal. Southern companies tended to use the police, militias, and local mobs to violently resist unionization in textile factories. And in an era that was so focused on providing for businesses, unions often failed in their efforts to strike. So as we've seen, the 1920s were an era of prosperity, brought about largely by political support from Republican presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. But prosperity and flexibility towards businesses can, and did, only last so long. And so when the economy did finally crash in 1929, Americans were woefully unprepared to take responsibility for the practices in the post-war boom.